One of my absolute greatest accomplishments of my professional career to date has been to win a 1.7 million euro grant for a capacity building project focused on gender inclusive innovation. It was an absolute surreal moment when I got that email. It's one of those things where you have to read it 3 or 4 times to realize. And of course, the message from the EU when I got that message was very cryptic whenever I read it. So I wasn't even quite sure that we had gotten the grant, but it definitely seemed like we had. So I had to send the email around to a few different people and say, am I interpreting this correctly? Did we actually get this grant? And then when I finally realized that, yeah, that is the case, I immediately called my partner and I sang a song of triumph. And we talked about what life was going to be like now that I have this project that I get to lead. Now, I talked about my journey as a feminist in a previous episode, so I'm not going to get into that as much. What I want to talk about is gender equality from my professional life, my academic life. I was always aware of the issue of gender inequality, but I had never connected gender issues to my main area of research, which was all about universal design. So universal design is just creating things that everyone can use equally. And I never really quite made that connection between gender inclusion and universal design. It just never really got connected for me. And this is partly because the whole field of universal design came out of a disability rights tradition. And so that's where I was anchored. It was really focused in on disability rights, trying to understand this issue of universal design from a disability perspective. And that's a kind of one-dimensional way of seeing it, because if we think about universal design again as the design solutions of things to be usable by everyone equally, everyone includes women, obviously. And so there's kind of inherent a gender issue to it, but I couldn't make that leap cognitively from disability to gender. It just wasn't there for me. And I honestly don't think I'd ever have made that leap if it weren't for one of my students. I had just become an assistant professor at Oslo Metropolitan University, and the first bachelor group that I supervised had we can just call her a troublemaker. She challenged me every time we met. She challenged me on the way I thought, the advice I gave, everything. And I think for some people that would have come across as just annoying maybe, or it would have come across as kind of disrespectful. But when I heard her challenge me, for me, it was refreshing. I checked my expectations right off the bat and I said, okay, I feel uncomfortable. Let's see what there is behind this feeling of discomfort and what we can learn from this situation. So I just listened. I listened to what she had to say. I listened to her perspectives, and I tried to understand and I tried to learn. And then I tried to explain where I was coming from until we could find a common ground where we agreed, yes, this was the issue. And one of the first areas we reached common ground on was understanding that this concept of universal design is limited because of the traditions it came out of, and that there was a space, there was kind of a gap in what we know where gender could be brought into this perspective of universal design. So she finished her bachelor's thesis and did great on it. And so I immediately proposed we should work together somehow, and why don't we work on a research paper together? So she was crazy enough to say yes. And we ended up collecting a whole bunch of data on the experiences of anybody with multiple marginalized identities. So we were really looking at women with disabilities. We were looking at sexual minorities with disabilities, people of color with disabilities. So that way we weren't just trying to focus in on the issue of disability, but we were trying to get a broader perspective on issues around gender, race, and sexual orientation. So when we finished our study, we wrote up the findings and we submitted it to a conference, and it was accepted, and they published our article, and we also won an award for best paper from Cambridge University. So that was kind of a really unique and really invigorating and exciting starting point. A short time later, maybe a year or so, I got an email from the United Nations, from the International Telecommunications Union. My university is a member of that organization. And the email was about joining a group called Equals. And Equals was just this large-scale global network focused on digital gender equality. I had never really heard of it before, so I kind of dug up as much as I could learn about it, and it seemed like a really compelling opportunity for researchers to get into this area of gender and technology. And they were looking for researchers, so it was a perfect chance to work together. And within a few short months, I realized that a lot of the discussions that were happening within this network weren't necessarily focused on disability. They were focused more on the gender side of things than on the disability side of things. So I took it kind of as my mission to bring a disability rights component into those discussions. Now, I'm a middle-aged white guy. I'm an academic, so it can be problematic for me in a space where there is representation by a very broad, diverse group of people that's focused on bringing and lifting up marginalized communities. There can be a challenge for me to have a chance to make a statement. And that's just because I don't represent any of those groups. I don't speak for any of them. And so I had to really be deliberate and conscious and aware of of who I was, my own identity, as well as my role in those proceedings. And so when it came to working with groups that were focused in on the issue of gender inclusion and technology, I really had to approach it simply as someone to suggest other perspectives to understand these issues. And of course, my leading kind of discussion point was always about women with disabilities. So how can we focus in on issues around women with disabilities? And again, I didn't speak for them. It wasn't me speaking or advocating on their behalf. It was really just trying to decenter myself and recenter the discussion on this group of marginalized people, and especially women of disabilities of color or women of color with disabilities. And so it was really about taking the chance to bring a new perspective and a new light of inquiry onto this issue. Now, since then, I've had the honor to work with some really amazing advocates and scholars, people who are working at the absolute grassroots of these issues. And I have to continually remind myself how my privilege affects my participation in these spaces. And that it's really my responsibility to deal with my own discomfort whenever that occurs. Because chances are, if I feel uncomfortable, it's not because of any other reason than I haven't understood where another person might be coming from. And so when I experience that sense of discomfort, my first reaction is to just silence my voice and listen, try to seek understanding, have empathy and compassion for the other people who are in that room, and create space and decenter myself so those people have that chance to speak, to be heard. And so when I'm invited to spaces where there aren't equal representation of a diverse group, where there's a lack of representation, I try to always demand that there is a change to those spaces. And that does happen on occasion, even in the areas that I work in, that I find myself in a group of people who share a lot of similarities with me. And if we're talking about issues around diversity or around equality, it's my role, I believe, to remind them that the representation of those groups is absolutely critical to having a constructive dialogue. And for me, this is really the bare minimum of what I can do to help alleviate some of these issues of inequality in the world. And I say it's a bare minimum just because I don't see standing by idly as an option. If I stood by idly, I would be just as guilty as anyone of perpetuating these issues of inequality. So I try to take my role active. I try to make my role active as much as possible. And in situations where I'm surrounded by people with the same perspectives as mine, I try to make sure that those voices of underrepresented groups are interjected into that environment. And again, about decentering myself and recentering the lens, recentering the focus on those marginalized groups. So the takeaway is this: if you happen to be in a position of power, like I am a lot of times, take a few minutes, just step back and think. Think about how you can use your power to empower others. Consider the different ways, different options you have of decentering yourself and recentering focus on those marginalized groups that are at the heart of, that face all these issues of inequality. And think about how you can use your power to influence others who are in positions of power to create a more inclusive and a more equal world. And try the best you can to do better and to be better.